Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Life Groups. My name, if you don't know me, is Elijah Schreiber, and I'm excited to be teaching you guys and continuing our series on two wise men with the story of Elisha. Before we begin, I actually would love it if you took some time as your life group to read today's passage. It's a little bit on the longer side, so take a few minutes if you want, discuss some initial observations you have, and then come on back and we'll get started. So when I started reading this passage, one of the first things I noticed is that it read almost like a comedic play. We see that the Lord is at work through Elisha to preserve Israel and protect the king and the army of Israel from defeat. The Syrian king is then frustrated by the prophet's repeated assistance, and so he seeks to capture Elisha. But God then protects Elisha and displays his power, which leads to the Syrians themselves finding themselves in an ambush. As I read this text, I laughed a couple times, just imagining the faces of the Syrian army when God brought back their vision and they found themselves in the midst of a deadly scenario. But this brings us to our first point that we'll discuss from the text, which is that those who have faith in God can trust in his defense and his provision. In this text, we see two examples of the Lord's defense. The first is in verses 8 and 9, where the enemy plans ambushes and traps, but the Lord speaks through Elisha to warn the king of Israel. The text says that this happens, quote, more than once or twice, unquote, which paints a picture where the Syrian king is foiled again and again and again. The second time we see this is in verse 17, where we see that the Lord protects Elisha and his servant directly from the Syrian army which has surrounded the city. In both cases, we see God protect his chosen people. Another observation I saw is the interaction between Elisha and his servant. Faced with a scary or even deadly situation, Elisha's servant grew afraid, while Elisha had faith. When the servant expressed his fear to him, Elisha did not mock or belittle him. Instead, he reminded his servant of the truth, and he prayed that the Lord would open his servant's eyes so that he could reveal to him the truth. Seeing the army around Elisha and his servant gave the servant courage again. One important thing to notice is that Elisha still had to act. He prayed that the Lord would blind the Syrians, and then did the whole scenario of leading them into Samaria. The heavenly army was not, at least when we first saw it, attacking the Syrians. It's almost as if they were waiting for a command, defending the prophet until they heard from him. When Elisha prays for God to intervene, he does. So how can we apply these things to our lives? Well, one thing I've noticed is that some people trust God easily, and other people have a lot of struggle trusting God. We can attribute this trust to the Holy Spirit gift of faith, or even, you could argue, just through personal experience, as Elisha has seen many times the Lord provide, and his servant perhaps has not. Those of us gifted with the spiritual gift of faith should use it to remind those who don't have it that God is in control. And we should remind them with love and with gentleness, not belittling them or mocking them for their fear, but reminding them of the truth, and then praying that God would give them the courage and the strength to remember that. We'll take a few minutes now to discuss some questions with our life group, and then we'll come on back. Our second point tonight is that those without faith in God can be easily deceived or swayed. In today's text, we see the enemy beaten twice, in two ways. The first is where the Lord speaks with Elisha and warns of the Syrians' ambushes. And the second is when the Lord strikes the Syrians blind, allowing Elisha to lead them into danger. What does this teach us? Well, first of all, it shows us that our God is so much more powerful than our enemies, and he will protect us if it's in his will to do so. Some commentators also talk about this blindness that is mentioned in the text, suggesting that it's less of a, physical loss of sight and more like a dazed or mental condition, which leads the Syrians open to suggestion and manipulation. Mental, physical, or both, it results in them passively walking into danger. When you compare the Syrian army's experience to the experience of Elisha's servant, we see a few obvious differences. First of all, we see that Elisha's servant has his eyes opened to see things more clearly, while the Syrian men are blinded to the truth. We also see the servant's experience results in safety, surety, and confidence, while the Syrian men experience confusion, danger, and humiliation. Again, can you imagine the general reporting back when the army returned, saying something along the lines of, yeah, so Elisha tricked us, then he brought us into an ambush, but then he fed us and sent us on our way. I don't know for sure, but I think that general probably wasn't a general that much longer. Nonetheless, both of these experiences reveal the power of our God. He never let the Syrians trap Israel, and when the Syrians again tried to force their way into the battle, they were led into an ambush instead. Our last point is that faith in God requires listening to His will, even when it goes against our natural instincts. In today's text, we see that after Elisha leads the Syrians into danger, the king of Israel seeks to destroy them. But Elisha instead says, no, feed them, send them on their way. And this results in the Syrian army never again raiding Israel. Now, a few chapters later, there is a battle between the Israelite and the Syrian army, which the Israelites win. But at least for this time in Israel's history, in between those two occurrences, the Syrian army doesn't raid on Israel. What does this teach us? Well, first of all, going against the grain of the world, in accordance to the will of God, can often result in people having their eyes opened to their sin, at least briefly. The result isn't always that the world will agree with us or submit themselves to the Lord, but it often leads to good or the improvement of the world. Proverbs chapter 25, verses 21 and 22 say, "If your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat, and if he is thirsty, give him water to drink, for you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you." What does this teach us? Well, it shows us that responding to evil with good opens the eyes of the people that are doing evil to the fact that what they're doing isn't good. Like burning coals on their heads, it burns in their conscience, and so they're forced to react, forced to admit that something in the scenario isn't right. And since we're the one, hopefully, doing good, the only place the wrong can be is on them. In this instance, it clicked in the minds of the Syrians. Even past their sinful natures, they would be wrong to keep attacking the Israelites in raids. Perhaps you have difficult relationships, or even have outright enemies at school, in your family, past relationships. Your instinct might be to get revenge, to treat them poorly, or even seek some form of justice so that you can get what you think you owe. Even when those instincts come naturally or even seem justifiable, Jesus commands us to love our enemies. Sometimes it's that act of love that causes our enemies to recognize their wrongs and, Lord willing, begin their journey of salvation. We'll end tonight with a few more questions with our life group and then with prayer. I hope to see you guys on Sunday morning. Bye.